YouTube family, welcome back. And to any of you first-time viewers out there, welcome to my channel. My name is RillSheed Bonner, and I'm a school psychologist and behavior intervention specialist. Let's dive into a little bit of school psychologist Q&A. Most of these questions have been sitting in my email or comment section for a while now, so it feels pretty good to finally get to some of these questions. And hopefully I can address them all in this video, but probably not. And so I assume this will be an ongoing series, which I like. So let's go ahead and start with the first question. How much free time do you typically get in a workday? Great question. Now, this depends on the number of factors. One factor is, where do you work? Do you work for a large public school district that's significantly understaffed and/or has a number of programs for students with disabilities? If so, you probably won't get as much free time. Do you work in an early childhood center, elementary school, middle school, or high school? Also, do you work for a private agency, or do you have your own private practice outside of the schools? Maybe you work in a juvenile or youth detention or correctional facility, okay? All of these things are significant factors. Now, in my experience, elementary schools have a very high demand for school psychologists because this is the first time many students are referred for intervention due to academic and/or behavioral and social emotional concerns. And it's also the first time many students are being evaluated, period. And in many instances, that initial psychological evaluation is the most lengthy and thorough evaluation the student will receive. Now, this doesn't mean that this can't happen in middle school or high school, because sometimes students do receive initial evaluations in middle or high school. This is true, especially for students who come from out of district or out of state without the appropriate paperwork and documents, which means you pretty much have to start from scratch, which is very frustrating when you know that there's information out there that could easily help the team identify what's going on with the student and why the student has been identified as having an emotional disturbance or maybe a learning disability, but you just don't have access to it. It's annoying. Now, a couple more questions that factor into the amount of free time you can expect. Is your school a more restrictive setting for students with an emotional disturbance or emotional disability, autism, intellectual disability, or multiple disabilities? The bottom line is, some settings service populations that are in greater need for the psychological and mental health services you are equipped to provide. Here's a couple other questions to consider. Are you working in a new school, or is it a school you're familiar with? Also, what's the culture of the school when it comes to discipline and intervention? For example, I'm about to get on my soapbox here. Does the school have a more proactive approach to behavior and discipline that's focused on the development and implementation of behavioral interventions, or does the school adopt a more zero tolerance policy when it comes to discipline, and do they forego behavioral interventions and data collection because they're tired of the student's behavior and the only interventions they're willing to implement are suspension or an alternative placement, which means basically in a different building, of course, or referral to the IEP team because they suspect most students with behavioral concerns have a disability? You see where I'm going with this, okay? Here's what I want you to do. I want you to chime in the comments below if you're an educator, mental health professional, school psychologist, or parent who has seen this before. Also, what is your role and function as a school psychologist? Do you have a more comprehensive role that encompasses more than assessment and evaluation? Does your role and function include the development and implementation of academic and behavioral interventions, counseling, consultation? Consultation's always there. It's a staple. It's a cornerstone. Professional development and PBIS, or is 98% of your job administering psychological assessments and evaluations, attending meetings, and completing paperwork as a special education gatekeeper? Now, another factor is something pretty simple, but your free time also depends on the time of the year. Now, in my experience, the most chaotic times of the year are the first few weeks of the new school year. So depending on where you are, anytime between late July and late August, give or take a week or two. The beginning of the second quarter. The holidays is another one, so mid-November to mid-January. Basically, whenever you start hearing Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You, that's it, okay? The middle of the third quarter, which is pretty much our own version of March Madness, and the end of the school year in the spring. Now, these are typically times throughout the year that I've seen significant spikes in referrals for intervention or evaluation, or significant spikes in students with behavioral concerns and/or significant social, emotional, or developmental needs. Now, I get it. That was a very long-winded way of saying some days you'll have more free time than others. the days can be very unpredictable. So you can't always tell when you'll have more or less free time. I've had days when my schedule was jam-packed and I had 5 meetings from 9 a.m. until 3 p.m., but 4 out of the 5 meetings were canceled because the parents didn't show up. I've also had days where I thought I could hit the easy button, but I got called to respond to a crisis in another building, or I was informed about a student who expressed intent to harm themselves, and I had to intervene ASAP. So, yes, it depends. Next question. What characteristics make a good school psychologist? Excellent question. So I really had to think about this one because I came up with these characteristics. The first one is curiosity. If you heard me present to early career school psychologists and school psychologists in training, you've heard me refer to curiosity as our superpower. Now, I say this because most of us didn't learn to be curious. We got into the field because we're curious by nature and we know how to ask the right questions to get to the source of the concern. Integrity, or your honesty and soundness of moral character. Empathy, or your ability to identify with the thoughts, attitudes, and emotions of others. In other words, your ability to read the room and put yourself in the shoes of others. Resilience, or your ability to bounce back from adversity, which brings me to adaptability, all right? Or your ability to adjust to different conditions or circumstances. And last but not least, communication. So I'm talking about being an effective communicator. Are you able to express your thoughts in a way that's easy for most others to understand? And are you capable of staying present? Are you capable of listening? And are you capable of understanding when other people are expressing themselves? Now, I'm sure I can think of other characteristics, but these are the ones that came to mind off jump. Let me know in the comments down below if there are other qualities that make a good school psychologist. Question number 3, is conflict common with the job? It can be. Yes, there will be people who disagree with you, your data, and or your professional opinion. And this may be teachers, administrators, specialists, related service providers, other school psychologists, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, parents and caregivers, students, and especially advocates and attorneys. But relax, don't be overwhelmed. In my experience, most disagreements will be in good faith, meaning they typically disagree because they don't know something or aren't clear about something. This is why I listed good communication and curiosity as essential characteristics, because I think leading with curiosity and asking good questions helps make sure that we understand the other person or other people and what they're trying to say. And effective communication skills allows us to disarm a potential volatile situation, which brings me to my last point. Some conflicts and disagreements will be in bad faith, especially when dealing with some advocates and attorneys. Sometimes people come to the meeting or show up at your door ready for smoke and ready to disagree, regardless of how curious you are or how effective of a communicator you are. Now, it's important to identify these situations, keep your ego in check, and agree to disagree or just discontinue the interaction altogether because, again, it's not about you and it's not about winning an argument. Now, also, let me say this, once in a blue moon, you might realize the other person that disagreed with you, they might actually have a good point or two. It's all about doing what's legal, what's ethical, and in the best interest of the student. That's what matters, okay? Next question. What is the quality of life like for a school psychologist during the school year? This depends on so many factors, okay? It depends on your role and function as a school psychologist and if you're happy in your role. It also depends on if you feel supported by your school, your colleagues, administrators, the lead school psychologist, the supervisor or coordinator, etc. One of the biggest determining factors is this. Are you happy outside of work, right? I'm talking about family, friendships, relationships, or marriage and physical health, because all of these can heavily influence your quality of life. Personally, I believe it's important to keep work at work as much as possible so that work doesn't significantly impact your personal life and vice versa. I know it's easier said than done, especially when you're first starting out. And if that starts to become an issue, it's okay to take a rest and take a break so you don't burn out, and or it's okay to seek assistance. Next question. In your opinion, would your typical school psychologist have enough energy to be a part-time therapist after work hours? Short answer, yes, but there's a caveat here. Hear me out. I know school psychologists who have a very good setup and work for an education or behavioral health organization or work independently after working their 9 to 5 in a school district. Now, I personally did this for 5 or 6 years. With that being said, here's my take. Just because you can do it doesn't necessarily mean you should. It can be very taxing and draining, so make sure you have time for you. Now, I stopped doing contract work after work hours because it just wasn't sustainable after calculating whether the time I was investing in contract work was adequately reflected in my pay. Basically, I had to sit down, and you should also sit down and ask yourself if the extra money you're getting for doing therapy or consultation or any contract work after hours is worth sacrificing your me time and your mental health. Sometimes it just feels good to come home and detach, especially if you had one of those exhausting days. All right, next question. Oh, this is a major one. Have I experienced any discrimination in this field being a Black male? Yes. I ain't even gonna hold you, my guy. Yes. I have a lot of stories, but most of them are from my first couple of years as a school psychologist, and none of them include parents. They all include administrators and a couple of teachers. Let me explain. When I started my career almost 18 years ago, some administrators and teachers were used to seeing older white men and women in my position, okay? They were also used to school psychologists taking on the role of special education gatekeeper and preserving the cycle of test in place without ruling out other factors and or implementing research-based interventions and collecting data on said interventions. So some teachers and administrators, they were not very comfortable seeing a young Black man in my position, challenging in a respectful and professional manner, of course, the status quo. Now, in my program, I was trained to place heavy emphasis on response to intervention, or RTI, and to only assess if necessary and the team has enough data to suspect a disability. That led to some very spirited discussions and some passive aggressiveness and some microaggressions from a very small handful of administrators and teachers. Now, I do have a couple stories. Actually, I have a few stories, but I'm going to save those for individual videos. Let's move on. Next question. Would you recommend the Ed.S program or the Ph.D school psychology program? And do you have any regrets for the program you chose? That's ultimately a decision for you to make after weighing your goals against the pros and cons of each program. Now, I chose the Ed.S or Education Specialist program because I knew I wanted to work in schools and there wasn't a significant difference between the salary scales in most districts in Ohio. I was tired of coursework, taking out student loans, working 2 part-time jobs to pay off student loans, and I didn't want to do a dissertation because I saw way too many people stuck in dissertation purgatory for years. Also, you didn't need a doctorate or Ph.D. to practice independently as a licensed school psychologist in Ohio. Once you received your MED and Ed.S, I believe all you had to do was take an oral exam with the State Board of Psychology to be licensed. But again, I didn't really have plans to become independent, so it wasn't that much of a big deal. But as I get older, sometimes I do think about going back to get my doctorate, but in a different field like clinical or counseling psychology. Look, man, I'm getting a little long in the tooth. I'm sure you see the gray hairs in my beard. So I've been thinking about ways to pass my skill set down to school psychologists and training in early career school psychs. So no regrets. And you should make a decision that's best for you after doing your research and weighing your options. Okay? Good talk. All right, last question. What made you the most nervous early in your career? There were a couple of things that stand out. For starters, I was really nervous about attending meetings with attorneys. I remember taking my legal, ethical, and best practices in school psychology course and thinking, I pray to God I can go my whole career without ever meeting an attorney or having a case that goes to due process. Why? Because I heard nothing but horror stories about due process hearings and how taxing and stressful and intimidating they can be. I also heard how rude and sneaky some attorneys can be, so I didn't want any of that smoke. But little did I know, meeting with advocates, attorneys, and being an expert witness in due process hearings would become a significant role in my career as a contractor for about 6 years. So much so that I currently help train early career school psychologists on how to work with advocates and attorneys and how to testify as an expert witness in due process hearing. Again, that is a whole video. Last thing is this. Early in my career, I had a healthy dose of confidence, but I was very well aware that I still had a lot to learn, right? Especially when it came to putting the state and district policies into practice. I could administer and score assessments with my eyes closed. I could work with students with behavioral and social emotional challenges and concerns. But I remember being most intimidated about telling parents their child had a disorder or disability that the parent wasn't necessarily ready to accept. Look here, man. Parents and caregivers concerned about their child's development, well-being, and success want answers. They want to know why their child isn't succeeding academically or why their child can't read. They want to know why their child easily forgets information they just absorbed or why they can't focus on the task. They want help keeping their child safe at school and at home after they've expressed thoughts to self-harm. And sometimes those answers aren't what parents are ready to hear. So those same answers may be difficult for them to process. And sitting with the parent and telling them that their child has an intellectual disability or autism spectrum disorder or even ADHD can be tough if you're not accustomed to it. And for some parents, there's a negative stigma attached to neurodevelopmental disorders and conditions, mental illness, and psychiatric disorders. So I've had some parents assume that a diagnosis and or needing special education services meant that their child was crazy or destined to be a failure or the dreaded R word. And some parents become angry and may direct their anger at you as the school psychologist, the team, or the school in general. Some parents turn their anger and disappointment inwards and beat themselves up, thinking that they're the reason their child isn't normal or neurotypical. And again, given the negative stigma attached to mental health, mental illness, and different conditions and disorders, I understand why some parents believe and do this. I do. But this is where we come in as school psychologists. And as a school psychologist, I do my very best to rule out all of the factors that may contribute to a child's academic performance and or behaviors and challenges such as their attendance and exposure to the curriculum, the implementation of research-based interventions or lack thereof, patterns in behavior across settings and different people, observations in any significant medical history and background. What I do is I lead with empathy and curiosity by being non-judgmental, asking the parent if they have any questions, and using this as an opportunity to educate the parent on their child's condition. It goes a long way, trust me. Man, that was a long video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I really hope that it was helpful. And for all of my prospective school psychologists, I hope that you have a slightly better understanding of the career, okay? Now, maybe you have other questions. Great, because I want you to feel free to leave them in the comments down below or shoot me an email at RillSheed@gmail.com and I'll include them in a future video. Also, do not forget to like the video, share, and subscribe. That is all for today. So in the meantime, you already know what it is. Take care of yourselves and one another. Peace.